The Sassoons, the great global merchants, and the making of a dynasty. The influential merchants of the 19th and early 20th centuries shaped the globalization of today. The Sassoons, a Baghdadi Jewish trading family, built a global trading enterprise by taking advantage of major historical developments during the 19th century. Their story is not just one of an Arab Jewish family that settled in India, traded in China, and aspired to be British. It also presents an extraordinary vista into the world in which they lived and prospered economically, politically, and socially. The book is not only about their rise, but also about their decline. Why it happened, how political and economic changes after the First World War adversely affected them, and finally, how realizing their aspirations to reach the upper echelons of British society led to their disengagement from business and prevented them from adapting to the new economic and political world order. Joseph Sassoon is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and professor of history and political economy at Georgetown University. He holds the al-Sabah chair in politics and political economy of the Arab world. He is also a senior associate member at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He has published extensively on Iraq and its economy and on the Middle East. The Sassoons is his fifth book. The book is truly a scholarly work, and yet remains very approachable and readable. It should appeal to both academic and general reader alike. We thank Professor Sassoon for joining us to give a talk this evening on his book. As a small Babylonian Jewish community, we are especially pleased to welcome him, and thank him for both the book and his time this evening.
Following the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians, there were thriving Jewish community in all cities and what is now called Iraq, and there were likely more Jews there than anywhere else in the Arab East. But according to a rabbi who visited Baghdad in 1824, there were about 6,000 Jewish families and 5 large synagogues in Baghdad at the time of his visit. A year later, a traveler estimated that there were 7,000 Jews out of a total population of 50,000 and noted the prominent role the Jews played in the country. The community, who came to be known as the Babylonian Jewry, possessed its own language called the Baghdadi Jewish, a dialect of Arabic written in Hebrew letters. And actually, this is really the main reason that I engaged in the history. I didn't want to write just a book on the history of the Sassoon, but when I discovered an incredible trove of these documents, tens of thousands of them, this is the family correspondence, over 100 years at the National Library in Jerusalem, I thought this is a great story to be written. Now, what you're seeing is really 3 languages. It's the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, it's Arabic, and it's written in Hebrew letters. The language itself is Arabic. Notice that in the original, there are no paragraphs. It jumps from one item to another. I put obviously the paragraphs in English to make it easier. Starts very formal, ends very formal. I thought, since you are all Babylonian and Baghdadi Jews, I will read you a couple of lines just for your ears. And you will notice that actually there are words in Hebrew, there are words in Turkish, there are words in Persian. أحدثه بعده يا أخي تعلم كل كثير سابق من سنغافور حررتو لك الإيدك بالخير ومن بعدها من بنانغ هم كان بخاطري أكتب لك ولكن لم صار فرصة وبعزغات الشيم يوم بيت 10 فبراير وصلنا إلى كلكتة بالسلامة والرافل ياهو جاي يتلقانا من المركب دكان ونزلنا عنده يوم ثالث ووصل صوبنا عبد الله لهالطرف واحنا رحنا الى بردوان درب 70 مايل يما تلاقينا معاه. And on. This gives you a little bit of a sense of it. It is really truly remarkable, this collection. Not only there are these archives between all the family members, but they kept also the ledgers of trades, which I will come back to it in a minute. So who are the characters in the book? There are quite a number of characters, but let me talk about quickly about the five main characters in the book. David Sassoon, which I will come back to, he's the founder. 1829, he and his father fled Baghdad because there was a corrupt governor. They did not leave because of anti-Semitism. This corrupt governor was arresting members of well-off families and asking for a ransom. David and his father escaped to southern, what is now Iran, southern Persia, stayed there for some time. David's father died a year later, and David decided to take his young family and move to Bombay. At the time, David had one from his first wife, who died very young after bearing him 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. He later, a year later, married, and his new wife came with him to escape at the same time. Later on, the second wife and him had 10 children who survived. So in total, he had 14 children that we know of them. Others who died at a very young age, we really don't know. And in the book, I argue that they were the first kind army, small army, that constituted this huge network that he built throughout the globe. Abdullah, or later on Albert, and as you will read in the book, and I will tell you that basically almost without exception, they all anglicized their name at some point. Second son, Elias, who really kind of worked mostly in China and built the bridges for a huge trade with China. One of the most hidden gems in this book is the discovery that the Sassoon had the only woman who was a CEO of a global trading firm at the end of the 19th century. I teach a class about family histories and in business. Let me tell you, there are a lot of matriarchs in the world at the time, at the end of 19th century, North America, Europe, Asia, Middle East, but not a CEO of a global trading firm running the firm on a daily basis, and in a very, and you cannot believe also how sophisticated the business at the time was. I will come back to Victor to explain his connection, but at this point, suffice to say, he's the great grandson of Elias. There are many other characters. There is the famous poet Siegfried Sassoon of World War I. There is Sir Philip Sassoon, a major art connector and connoisseur of art. And actually, if any of you go to the Jewish Museum in New York City, there is now, for the next 5 months until mid-August, there is a huge exhibition about the Sassoon. You will find a lot of the art either commissioned or collected by Philip Sassoon. And apart from Siegfried Sassoon, there was also Rachel Bear Sassoon, the first editor of a national newspaper in Britain in 1916-17, long before women had the right to vote in Britain. So let's talk a little bit about the founder. What is really fascinating is actually neither he nor his father were merchants in Baghdad. His father was the tax collector on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, who sat in Constantinople, appointed a governor and appointed a tax collector. In today's jargon, call it Minister of Finance. The two were not connected. Each province, like Baghdad, has its own governor and its own tax collector, Sarraf Bashi. And from time to time, governors or the tax collector were changed and appointed by a firman, by an edict from the Sultan. As I explained briefly before, a bad governor, a corrupt governor came in. The father, whose name was Sheikh Sassoon, stopped being the tax collector. And once they started being harassed by this new governor, they fled the country. What is really, truly also amazing is when you look at these correspondence and the history books of their trade, there wasn't a one trade or one event that suddenly he became very wealthy. Absolutely not. In fact, if I looked at the Indian archives of the local newspaper, he's not even mentioned in the first decade there that he's there, because he was a very, very small and insignificant trader or a merchant. But he keeps building slowly and gradually. First thing, he started going to the cotton exchange in Bombay and decided to get into the cotton business. Why? Because in the 1850s, there was a bad harvest in the United States and cotton prices rose. David Sassoon figured out this is a commodity that goes up and down. Good thing to get in. So he started buying small quantities and increased it slowly but surely. Of course, came in 1861, the American Civil War, cotton prices quadrupled, and it really changed the whole business. India became very important for cotton trade. Cotton prices were frenzy about them, that there were rumors that people were tearing their mattresses in order to sell the cotton in there. That's the good side. The bad side is new countries like Brazil, Egypt started producing. So price of cotton in the first 2 years skyrocket and then starts going down. By the end of the American Civil War, 82% of Indian traders filed bankruptcy. David Sassoon and his two sons at the time were very, very conservative, risk-averse. They avoided this mayhem, but it also created opportunities as so many of traders were out of business. The second important commodity, and I am going to talk about it later a little bit more, is opium. Opium became legal after the First Opium War. Britain goes to war against China from 1839, 1842. At the end of the war, which China lost, two things happened. 5 major ports, such as Shanghai and Hong Kong, are open to foreign traders to trade and settle. And 2, opium becomes legal. David Sassoon sends his second son, Elias, to China to explore the possibilities, and thus began the trade in opium. There was a second opium war, which more than Britain, France, America, all got involved and forced China to open totally, and made it even more legal from the mid-1850s. And I'm going to come back and talk about it given the sensitivity of the subject. From the beginning, David Sassoon realized that there is one and only one superpower in the world at the time, Britain. So he decided to ally himself with Britain from the beginning, and he insisted that he and his family, become part of Britain. what is really fascinating, when he got to Bombay, which was a small city of 200,000 people, but very cosmopolitan, he never learned English. He learned Hindustani. He ensured that his children get the best tutors to learn the best English possible, but he didn't learn. And in fact, this document in the archives, which is his statement and swearing to, was signed by Hebrew. Of course, he really never understood why he is swearing to a sovereign and a stock company, which is the East Indian Company. For you, I mean, just to let you know that the East India Company was the power controlling India until 1857, when the British took over from East India Company. From the beginning, the Sassoons believed in large mansions in order to be able to entertain wherever they went. On the bottom left, to mine, I don't know where you're saying, the Sanssouci Bikula Bombay is the first house that David Sassoon bought. It's a magnificent building. It is now a hospital. When I went to see it, the reason I went to see it, because I kept reading in the archives, in those correspondence, that like one dinner, he entertained 1,100 people. And I kept thinking, where do you entertain 1,100 people? Well, when I went there, I realized I went into that patio sticking out. It's now a hospital with a huge number of other buildings. Later on in his life, before his death, he moved to Pune, which is about 4 or 5 hours from Bombay, has a little bit better weather, less humid. And there he built a house. By the way, his son expanded this house, but also built a Sassoon hospital. And although it's officially the General Hospital of Pune, but go to Pune and everyone calls it Sassoon Hospital. No one knows it by the new name. When they moved to Britain, they also bought these houses, whether in London, whether in outside London, like Ashley Park, or in Brighton, kind of the equivalent of the Hamptons to New York. They were known for their hospitality everywhere, and entertainment was an opportunity to show off host the Baghdadi Jewish cuisine. One menu I found in the archive, let me read to you. Chicken kebab, maraq kubba, which is the soup of meatballs, hamad with beetroot, meatballs with sour beetroot, and of course, beet, the signature Baghdadi Jewish dish, a variety of rice dishes, rishta, and then later on in certain things, there was the kahi, followed by custard, pudding, and peach tart. And food was always important. Let me just tell you one little anecdote. They began their connection to the royal family of Britain at a very early stage when the Prince of Wales visited Bombay. And Flora, that you saw her picture before, hosted him. She was an amazing hostess, in addition to being an incredible businesswoman. And then she thought, what do you give the Prince of Wales as a parting gift? And she didn't really know. And then she gave him amba and mishmish yibis, the mango and the dried egg. And later on, when he arrived, you know, the journeys were 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks by boat. He wrote to her from London a wonderful letter. And he told her, look, there is a rule on these ships that anyone, whether me or any sailor who gets food, we share it. But I took the amba, and I put in 1 spoon, and I loved it. And I decided to break the rules and not to share it. And every day I had 1 spoon of amba with my food. One of the most fascinating things about the Sassoon business is charity. So in their trade book, you could see that they have each trade register. So they bought a chest, for example, of tea, cost of transport, maritime insurance, and then always the last item, 0.25, 1/4% of tzedakah. They tax themselves on each trade, irrelevant of whether the trade was profitable or not, which is really not only innovative, but very creative. And at the end of the year, 1/4% doesn't seem a lot, but when you're doing hundreds of trades, it's huge. And that allowed their philanthropic work. And the philanthropy was kind in 2 parts. Part 1, synagogues. So the blue synagogue you're seeing, which I went to visit, and it's close to David Sassoon's house in Bombay, and a functioning museum that the Indian government renovated about a decade ago, is a stunning building, a stunning synagogue. The one to the left, when he moved to Pune, he also built this one. And he actually is buried in the gardens in the Ohel David in Pune. It was not only Jewish charities, it was not only synagogues. He built a school for girls. There was a school for reforms for juveniles in Bombay. There is any one of you who has been or will go to Mumbai, you can ask any taxi driver to take you to the Sassoon Library, which is a stunning building in the heart of Bombay. So, children, 12 children, 14 children, sons-in-law are spread all around. And this is what you see 30 years later, which is absolutely amazing. All those branches, all those dotted areas, business and everywhere. So now we have cotton and we have opium, but we have also rice and wheat and textile and spices and pearls, and from time to time, if there is a special thing in gold or diamond. The 3 major stars that you see are the 3 hubs. First, the big hub is Bombay. The second hub is Shanghai. And finally, in the 1870s onward, London. Phenomenal expansion. So let me go back to David Sassoon. David Sassoon died in 1864, left a will, which I saw in the archives, very clear. My oldest son, Abdullah, shall become the next chairman. The second son, Elias, who, as I mentioned, went to China, explored, opened the routes, was really in charge of all that business, said that is not fair. I traveled more than anyone else. I brought in the last 5-7 years more profits than anyone. We should split 50-50. 3 years of negotiations, and some of it is in the archives. It fails, and by 1867, we have 2 competing companies, both carrying the name Sassoon. David Sassoon & Co., Edie Sassoon & Co. David Sassoon & Co. run by Abdullah. Edie stands for Elias David Sassoon. And Victor, that I showed you before in one of those 5, is, as I said, the great-grandson of Elias. Till the last minute of their lives, They competed with each other. They never exchanged a word. And I actually, if you read the book, and I hope you read it, I actually blame David for this in the sense that he should have realized that it's not simple and straightforward, and that this tradition that he inherited from his father doesn't mean it passed further along. Few years after his death, Abdullah, given that some of his brothers have already moved to London, in 1872, he becomes knighted by Queen Victoria, changes his name, and from that moment, he is known as Sir Albert. Then a year later, he moved to England, to London, and he really, truly is granted with another honor. It's a presentation of the freedom of the city. He was the first Jew ever to receive this. You have to understand, London was the capital of the world from a financial point of view. That is now it's bestowing its biggest honor on Sir Albert. It is really, truly a remarkable achievement. We have to think that 40 years before, father and son, Abdullah was barely a teenager, left as refugees and without anything. And then here they are. And this moment is very important because it signifies the real desperate need of Abdullah and his brothers, and at the end, the family, to become more English than English. They wanted to be part and parcel of the upper class Britain. And they did everything. They managed to get titles. Albert's son ended up becoming a member of parliament, marries Elaine de Rothschild. So there are intermarriages with wealthy families in Europe. And basically, the vast majority of the Sassoon began to see themselves as British rather than Baghdadi Jewish. I want to talk for a second about this. This is the emblem of the family that actually Abdullah created and designed after David's death. In the 100 years of correspondence in the archives, not once the question is raised, should we deal with A or B because of his religion or nationality or sect? Never, ever. What you see is the question, should we trust our counterpart? And trust is really part of the story that global merchants at the time developed and built a business based on one thing only, not about nationality, not about religion. It was about a trust. And hence the significance in the emblem to emet ve'imuna, to this trust that has to be part and parcel. Candide et constante is in Latin. There are some symbols from the Bible, from Baghdad with the palm tree, but there is also other symbols. As I mentioned before, there was a move to England. To me, this picture symbolizes everything. This is the family that only a generation or two before was working 6 days a week, 14, 15 hours. Yes, they had big houses, but they focused. Now they are part of the upper aristocracy. What are they doing? Hunting, shooting, estates. This is in Scotland. I found in the archives a wonderful letter of two members of the family then saying, we went to the office at 11 o'clock in the morning. At 1 p.m., we went to the club for lunch. And at 3 p.m., we went to the horse race to bet on horses. And I kept thinking, my first reaction when I saw it, wow, David Sassoon must be turning in his grave, thinking that members of his family are going to the office at 11 o'clock and then spending the afternoon rather than working, betting on horses. This tells you the whole story of this Anglicization that took place in an incredible way. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop sharing. There are a lot of things I'm happy to talk about, but I will take your questions. Thank you. Yes. So when David Sassoon escaped with his father in 1830, the remainder of the siblings stayed behind. Some of them left later on, much later, and some, like my family, stayed in Baghdad until the early 1970s. So, yes, related, but not directly from the line of David Sassoon. Yes, absolutely. I mean, so the family began to marry. The marriages play really an important role. You have, in the beginning, only Baghdadi Jews. And if they didn't find those Baghdadi Jews in India, emissaries would go to Baghdad to found a partner. Then there was the move to London, and then began the intermarriages with European Jewish families, the Rothschild, the Polyakovs from Russia, in France, in Italy, the Trieste family. This really important thing. The son of Edward, who's Abdullah's son, became an MP. But at some point also after Flora, so the story of Flora is really sad because the men in the family refused to accept her success. They were very jealous. And they sat in London, and although they were not working, they kept conspiring against her until they managed to push her out. Afterwards, really that side of the family, that was the beginning of the end of that part of the family of David Sassoon and co. The other part found a new leader, a new life with Victor Sassoon, who moved from Bombay to Shanghai and created another empire in real estate. No more trading in commodities. If you go to Shanghai or have been to Shanghai, one of the most beautiful buildings in the Bund is the Sassoon building. Today is a 5-star hotel called the Fairmont Peace Hotel. There's even a small Sassoon museum. And that family continued to expand and enrich itself, but then one disaster after the other. Shanghai is first invaded by Japan in 1937, then World War I, and after Pearl Harbor. Victor, by the way, also played a huge role in helping refugees from Europe who escaped to Shanghai, because Shanghai was one of the very, very few places in the world that admitted Jews at the time without the need for a visa. So yes, there was a lot of connection between those families.
I have a question and then a request. The question is, in the current world and the more recent world, there's a lot of anti-Semitism around. And as Jews, we are always so sensitive to this, and we look over our shoulder, and we do our best to try and avoid, being seen as elitists or as more differential to Jews and otherwise. Did they experience anti-Semitism?
So it's really interesting. One of the things that I talk about in the book that I think over look, anti-Semitism was rampant in Britain at the end of the 19th century. But if you compare them to the Rothschilds, they experienced less anti-Semitism. And let me give you a few reasons. One is they were part of the anti-Semitism is this issue of money lending. They were not in the money business. They were never bankers. They never lent any money. So that tag of money lenders as Jews was gone. Two, they were successful merchants, and merchants was a reputable profession, unlike money lenders. Three, what is really fascinating, the British don't like nouveau riche. They don't like people coming from the bottom. They don't want to accept it. That was not the case with the Sassoons, because they knew that of their history in Baghdad as being the Nasi, the president of the community, the tax collector on behalf of the emperor of the Ottoman Empire. And then by the 50s, in Bombay, they were called merchant princes. They were 5, 6 merchant princes, and David Sassoon was one of them. So from a class point of view, you're not coming from the bottom, you are kind of on par with the aristocracy. There were other reasons. The fact that your sponsor and your best friend is the Prince of Wales, it meant that if you're attacking them, by the way, newspapers attacked him and wrote articles, why are you spending so much money with so much time with these foreigners? Even Churchill wrote about this. He seems to be so close to them. And by the way, his relationship continued after he became a king. The other thing is there was a movement of liberalism in Britain at that time, which believed that in free trade, but also believed in liberal ideology. And one of the fascinating things that Britain should accept talent, irrelevant of where it comes from. And so all those things help them. I am not saying that they didn't face anti-Semitism, but overall, if you are grading their acceptance in British society and their absorption of the British mutually, I would have to say, yes, they succeeded, but the price was very heavy because they lost all the business and all this drive to become successful.
Can I ask Joe to say a few words? Joe, you've been in touch with Professor Sassoon from the get-go, and I didn't thank you or acknowledge in the beginning, but I'd like to do so now. And Joe is an important senior member of our community, and he is a Jew who was born and raised in Calcutta, India. Recently went back, maybe not recently, a few years ago, to India on another trip, and always comes back with troves of information and historical and current affair truths about the influence of the Sassoons in India. So I wonder, Joe, if you can just say a few words about growing up, and did they really have influence on Jewish life?
I'm very familiar with a lot of the Sassoons as a family. In Calcutta, we had Sir David Ezra, who was he related to the Sassoons or just his wife?
He was married to
Rachel,
who was the daughter of a Flora Sassoon.
Okay. Yeah, because he was a big man in Calcutta. There's still a street in Calcutta named for him, Ezra Street, where he owned all the properties. And the other thing, Sion, you asked about anti-Semitism, is growing up in India. With the Indians, there was no anti-Semitism, virtually none. They are, I would say, the most tolerant people you can find. Certainly, you have problems between the Hindus and Muslims, but the Jews were never part of any of it, and it was not a problem. In Calcutta, we also still have a synagogue street, which is behind where there are a couple of the synagogues, and it was actually wonderful growing up there.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for the introduction to this group. It's a pleasure. And let me just add one thing because it relates to the previous question. So sometimes there were, by European in India,
Right.
measures that were against Jews or Indians, but that's because they said they were not Europeans. There is a wonderful story that I relate in the book about Sir David Ezra that they told him he's not accepted to a club, but they didn't realize he owned the real estate of the club.
Yeah.
And a similar story in Bombay when the first European hotel was finished, neither the Sassoons or the Tatas, who are Parsis, were allowed there. And so they took their revenge by building the Taj Hotel as a competition to the previous hotel. That definitely existed, and there were all kind of, the Jew from Baghdad bought the biggest house in Bombay. There was all kind of, but it always, as Joe was saying, really came. In fact, one of the loveliest things that you come across in the archives is the strong relationship that the Sassoons had. Although David Sassoon was very religious, was very traditionalist, and yet the relationship spanned literally every other religion. And in fact, he used to once a week study the Talmud with a missionary who, of course, didn't speak Arabic, but they, discussed it through a little bit of Hindustani and a little bit of Old Hebrew from the Bible.
Yeah. The other question I have is at the time I was in England, I did meet with Rabbi Sassoon, and how is he descendant? He had a yeshiva as well, and then eventually he moved to Israel, and I think he passed away there. But how was he descendant from the family?
He is the grandson of Flora also.
Okay.
So here is the interesting thing. She had 3 children. One, unfortunately, had an accident when she was a little kid, and then all her life was paralyzed and died in her early 20s. Then he had Rachel, who married Sir David Ezra, and then David, her son, who became the most important collector of Hebraica. And in fact, it was him who bought this Codex Sassoon in 1929 that you're seeing that it is going to be sold for 45-50 million. Unfortunately for the family, his son, the rabbi who is still alive, sold it in 1978. It's really amazing because when I was in Dallas last week, and I did a number of talks, and there were the people from Sotheby, and we did a seminar together about the Bible and its ownership. It turned out, one of the most fascinating things about this Bible, it tells you who bought it at different stages, going back to the year 1100, 1200, mostly from an area in today's world between Syria and Iraq, kind on that border, that in one of the wars in that 10th, 11th century, that thing was destroyed. But in 1929, Flora's son David buys this codex, the Bible, bind it. It actually weighs 28 pounds, so it's a serious book. and then sold it in 1978 for 350,000 pounds. You're not going to believe who bought it then. The pension fund of the British Rail, and sold it 11 years later for 3.1 million. So they made 10 times their money in 11 years.
I have a question. So I'm on, like, page 10 of your book. So I apologize if you mentioned this in the book, but I noticed on the map that Bahrain was marked. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about the Sassoon connection to Bahrain, because my grandfather was born in Bombay and was sort of shipped out to Bahrain to marry, to get married to my grandmother. And I was just wondering if there's anything that you could share about that.
So Bahrain comes up later on with the trade of pearls.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting because at the time, not only Jewish merchants, but other merchants who were harassed for different reasons used to go, and these were the options for David Sassoon when he sat in Bushir in southern Persia. Should he go to one of those places, and Bahrain was definitely one of them, because it's a very easy trip, it's Arabic, it's the same culture, it's the same everything, and the easiest and most convenient way. Or another possibility was some merchants ended up in Isfahan in Iran. For some reason, he decided on Bombay. What I find about it is that he sat in Bushir, which is a port city in southern Iran, started chatting to sailors, British merchants, and other merchants from other places. Remember, there was a huge trade between Bahrain and all these places and India. I mean, Bombay was really the first place and the easiest in a way at the time. And you have to think about the hazardous journey that they have to make. It comes up, and actually Sir Philip Sassoon goes to visit Bahrain for a different reason, in the 1920s.
Pierre Cartier was bought his pearls of the Cartier jeweler was buying his pearls in Bahrain.
In Bahrain, okay, good to know. I'll check that my next shopping trip to Cartier.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering if there's any connection or leadership at all between the Sassoon family in the UK and the early Zionist movement.
None. Actually, no. Let me just, because it's an important question. So one of the, kind foundation of their philanthropy is that they will give only and only to places where they live or they work or they have workers there. From time to time, there were rabbis who would come from Palestine and ask for money. They would give them some money. Flora's husband has given, but it's really more for a synagogue. There was really very little that I have found in the archives of discussion of Zionism or support of Zionism. And of course, my argument was the minute they went to Britain and became so enmeshed in the upper class, they definitely avoided the issue of Zionism to the end. And frankly, what Joe Jacob was mentioning, that rabbi was the first one ever to go and settle in Israel. No one settled before its creation and no one settled after its creation. until the early 1970s, I think, when the rabbi went there.
Professor, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you honestly very much for a great lecture, a great discussion. Your knowledge of the family is encyclopedic. It's all in here, and kol hakavod is all we can all say.
Thank you.
In the book, you certainly go into so much more detail, which is very, very interesting. You quote sources, but the movement, especially the very, very beginning, the escape from Iraq, the plague that was happening at the time, and I found it fascinating, and I urge whoever can, who's interested in this period of time. It is a historical book in general, and obviously a family and important book for the Iraqi community and the Jewish community.
Thank you very much to everyone who attended, and thank you for all of you, and wish you all the best.
To you too, Professor. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Hopefully we'll meet in good health and good occasions.
Amen.